Why, you ask, are the presidents of the 19th century so unmemorable? And the answer to that question is relatively straightforward, because the system was designed that way. The people who wrote the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, they intended that the center of gravity of the American political system would lie with the Congress. When they wrote their Constitution, the first article, the longest article, the one they spent the most time thinking about, debating, devising, refining, was Article 1. And Article 1 is all about the legislative branch. They knew that they wanted 3 branches of government, and that's why there is a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. But they thought that all the good stuff, all the important stuff was going to happen in Congress. The president was the chief executive. In fact, it's called the executive branch. What does the executive branch do? The executive branch executes the will of Congress. So it was as though the president was almost a hired gunner, the agent of Congress. It was thought that Congress would initiate legislation, that Congress would make these big decisions about policy, what the United States should do, what the United States should look like, how it should behave. And the president should essentially execute the will of Congress. Now, they also knew that for as long as they could envision, most of what Americans as individuals did by way of relating with government would take place in the states. They were creating this national government, this central government. They'd call it the federal government. They created this government, but they understood that the federal government would have limited authority. Most of what most affected people's lives would take place at the level of the states. So this president was not going to be probably as important in the lives of individuals, for example, as state governors, and not as important in the lives of individuals as Congress. Congress was where the power was going to be exercised. And it's for this reason that the heavy hitters, the stars of American politics in the 19th century, were almost always found in Congress. They usually started out in the House of Representatives, which is the more popularly elected branch. It's almost the farm team. But the real prize was to get elected to the Senate. Now, throughout the 19th century, senators were chosen by state legislatures. And so to become a senator, you had to have the distinction of being supported by your own state, the heavy hitters in your own state. And so this gave great weight to the kind of people who were chosen for the Senate. And some of the heroes of American political life in the 19th century were individuals who never made it out of the Senate, or more precisely, who never became president. And so there's a group called the Great Triumvirate. They were called that in their day. They've been called that by historians and students of history since. And these consist of Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Calhoun of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. And these were considered to be the stars. These were the rock stars of politics in the first half of the 19th century, which is when they were in office from roughly around 1810 to about 1850. Now, this is not to say that they didn't have the presidential itch. Ambitious individuals very often want to be sort of the one person, the guy. And in politics, in American politics, if you are a senator, if you're Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay was both at one time or another, you get the itch to be the one guy, the president. And Henry Clay, in fact, was nominated by his party for the presidency 3 times and lost all 3 times. Now, strikingly, if this had happened in the 20th century, or now in the 21st century, well, in the first place, no one would get 3 shots at it. If you lose once, you're usually considered damaged goods. If you lose twice, nobody's going to come back after that. But Henry Clay lost 3 times, and almost nobody thought the worse of him for it. When he died in 1852, he was eulogized as this towering figure of American politics. By comparison, presidents of that era were really hard to remember. When I say most 19th century presidents unmemorable, let's start with the ones you can remember, with Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and then Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, and then you pretty much run out. And there were lots of other presidents of that era. But what are we supposed to make of the Millard Fillmores and the Chester Arthurs and the John Tylers and the Franklin Pierces and the Benjamin Harrisons? Well, the answer is, at least according to the thinking of the framers of the Constitution, we weren't supposed to think much of them at all, because they didn't think much of this office that they had created. Things would change in the 20th century, but for the 19th century, the presidency was really not the plum position of American politics. Congress was where the action was. Congress was where reputations were made.